Hey everybody, good morning. Good morning from Suva. My name is Tara Chetty. I'm here at the Pacific Women's Support Unit. And for those of you tuning in online, you'll see that I'm actually situated in a room full of people, very unusual in this time of remote webinars. But here in Suva, we're lucky enough. This webinar is coming to you from the Women's Economic Empowerment Roundtable, an informal group of individuals and organizations who are engaged in advancing women's economic empowerment and who are concerned about how best to support women and girls as the pandemic affects and has a significant impact on our region. So we are very grateful to have here today in this webinar of women's economic empowerment in the context of COVID-19 in the Pacific, to have some wonderful speakers here with us today. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. For example, there's one here to my right. However, before we do that, I'd like to invite my colleague, Isabelle Gurney, who's coming to you live from Tasmania, a small island state to the south of Australia. And Izzy, could you please give us a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today and why it's important to us?
So thanks very much, Tara. And thanks everyone for joining our conversation on women's economic empowerment in the Pacific. And this is such an important area to explore and expand and interrogate, particularly in the current climate. So I'm just going to give a little background on this webinar and some of the areas that we're hoping to cover today, starting with what we know, but also what we hope to learn a little bit more about. So at the moment, we know that women are disproportionately affected by the impacts of the pandemic, and we know that women and girls are doing more domestic labour and childcare. We know that families are facing food shortages in Fiji, and we also know that the rates of men's violence against women has increased across the Pacific in line with global trends. We also know that women overall earn less than men and are more likely to work in low-paying, informal and precarious work. So the livelihoods that women typically rely on in the Pacific, as you all know, such as carers, vendors, farmers, fishers and daily wage earners, are very often in the informal sector, where income is not secure and there is no insurance, paid leave or safety nets. So given the informal nature of production and sales, the scales of women's financial loss during economic downturn often remains unmeasured and unrecognised. So the gender disparities in accessing government and business support initiatives are stark. So in Fiji, only 19% of businesses are registered to women, and in Solomon Islands, women are only half as likely as men to be in paid work. So economic response policies and business assistance are therefore likely to be far less accessible and less beneficial for women than they are for men. But we also knew much of this before the crisis, and it's clear that COVID-19 is exacerbating society's existing inequalities. So what we're asking today is, how can policymakers, advocates, governments, allies and development partners use this period of upheaval as an opportunity to address these social and economic inequalities? So how do we ensure that initial responses meet the different needs of women, girls, men and boys, but also plan for a more equitable and gender equal rebuild? So at Pacific Women, we try to use a gender transformative approach. So this involves recognising women's immediate needs and aspirations, as well as tackling longer term systemic inequalities. So a gender transformative approach in the context of women's economic empowerment, so that would consider short-term needs as well as long-term systemic change. And we're trying to consider issues such as, how are the most poor and marginalised women centred and supported in all responses? How are women in the informal economy supported? Is domestic work and childcare recognised and valued for its contribution to the economy and to society? Are women with disability supported and enabled to work? And how is the private sector prioritising the economy as well as the needs and rights of women and their communities? So that's why I'm excited about the panel here today, because these are such important conversations to have. And I hope you enjoy as we try to expand the conversation around women's economic empowerment and broaden our understanding of the changes brought by COVID-19 to women's paid and unpaid work, and how current economic priorities and measures can be reformed to be more equitable and responsive to the needs and priorities of all women. So we've got a lot to discuss today. So back over to you, Tara.
Thanks very much, Izzy. We are lucky to have some incredibly experienced specialists from the region joining us for this discussion. With me here in Suva, I was about to say in studio, that was a bit extra. With me here in Suva, I did it again, is Maureen Penjueli of the Pacific Network on Globalization. Maureen heads up PANG and has done for a number of years and is at the forefront of social justice movements, movements for climate equity, climate justice, and is of course very concerned and interested in how Indigenous knowledge systems can play a crucial role in shaping and responding to today's challenges. So we'll hear from you in a moment, Maureen. Also, fun fact, she's born on the island of Rotuma. That was interesting for me, who's known her for some time. We've also got dialing in, we're very lucky to have Asita Molotii dialing in from Funafuti in Tuvalu. Asita is the Director for the Gender Affairs Department and has been in that role since 2014. She's got extensive experience in promotion of gender equality in the region and also, of course, particularly in Tuvalu on working in gender mainstreaming, and now is heading the work for gender responsive COVID-19 response measures. So thanks so much for joining us, Asita. Dialing in from Papua New Guinea, we've got Brenda Andrias, who works with UN Women and is the program manager of the UN Women's Safe and Prosperous Districts program, which has got some, I understand, Brenda, similarities with the approaches that UN Women's Regional Office here in Suva takes in terms of the Markets for Change approach. So we'll be hearing from Brenda in just a moment. Also on the line, I'm looking if I can see her, we have Brigitte Leduc, who has been working closely with Asita. Brigitte, you may remember from her time at SBC, the Pacific Communities Social Development Program, but she is now Pacific Women's Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Advisor to the Gender Affairs Department, working closely with Asita. So we'd like to kick off first back here in Suva with Maureen. Now, Maureen is going to start off with a bit of a macro approach for us. So zooming out for a moment and thinking about COVID-19. Sorry, Maureen, I just realized before we go to you, I might let everyone know, both online and in the room here, at any point if you have a question, please do share them with Monica. For those in the room, there are Post-it notes. You can just pass them down the table to Monica and she'll put them up for us. For those of you online, you'll see there's a little Q&A button. Looks like two little chat bubbles, Q&A. You can put your questions in there and the team will field them for us here. So Maureen, coming back to a question for you, how is COVID-19? It's of course a terrible moment of fracture, of rupture, having huge impacts across the region, and we've been hearing about them in our meeting this morning. But how is it also an opportunity to perhaps redefine economic systems to be more responsive to the needs of women and to those living in poverty?
Thank you, Tara, and a good morning to Asita, Brenda, Isabella, and to everyone who is present here. That's a really big question, and it's one of those questions that you kind of need more than 5 minutes to respond to in any kind of critical way. I just want to thank Isabella for context setting, so I'm going to try not to touch on the things that she's already mentioned. But before you can deep dive into opportunities to redefine the economic system, particularly when we're looking at women and those living in poverty, it's always good to just surfacely look at what our economic structure looks like. And of course, we are small island states, but we like to consider ourselves large ocean island states now. We are dependent a lot on exports, particularly of raw materials, agricultural products. Outside of oil, gas, and minerals, your typical is fish, timber, logs, coffee, sugar, cocoa, fresh fruits, and vegetables. I think Isabella mentioned that in agriculture, of course, rural women dominate both rural farms, but also in markets and local markets specifically. Export orientation, most of our exports are to each other in the Pacific, so regional markets are quite important. Of course, things like fish, Japan, the US, the European Union are key markets for some of these major exports. For our closest neighbors, Australia and New Zealand, our combined as the entire Pacific, we rank probably 13th or 14th of our exports, agricultural exports into Australia and New Zealand. A real fun fact for people here, the Minister for Trade and Economics from Fiji in, I think, early February mentioned that there are only about 29 agricultural products that goes into the Australian market and 23 to New Zealand. So less than 30 of what we would say is a high-level agricultural produce enter these markets, largely due to very strict quarantine measures. Tourism is an important sector to look into, particularly because women, it's quite high in terms of its role in terms of overall GDP for countries like Fiji, Vanuatu, Samoa, and Cook Islands. In terms of jobs, and this is very important, particularly for Fiji, tourism makes up to 46% of GDP. It accounts for 36.5% of total employment, which is roughly 118,500 jobs. 30% of that is actually occupied by women. So when you're looking at tourism, it's really about accommodation, transport and storage, wholesale, retail, arts and entertainment are some of the key sectors around tourism. We are highly remittance dependent, Samoa, Tonga, Fiji specifically, and we're also aid dependent. Another key thing to keep in mind, and again, just to bring home what Isabella said, is that between 40 to 20% of our people, 40%, very high for a country such as Fiji, close to just a little bit over 50% of our people engage in the formal sector. Lowest in countries like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomons, around 20% are engaged in the formal sector. Again, the real emphasis on informal sector, majority of which are women with zero protections. So just really coming quite quickly to this, the question is, how do you redefine economic systems to meeting women's needs, particularly around poverty? And I think Tara's already said it quite clearly. Before we hit the pandemic, we were already seeing significant inequalities. And I think inequality is a better benchmark that we should be looking at. Between the extreme or the real obscene wealth in the world and those who don't have. So, you know, the measures of poverty by the World Bank, $1.50 per day, those measures, the inequalities are quite significant. Inequalities between countries, between rich developed nations, developing nations, and least developed countries. Inequalities within countries, between urban, rural. Those inequalities are the kinds of the tensions that we need to hold when we're thinking through how do we redefine economic systems. I just want to point to two and borrow from two really key reports that's coming out, that have come out recently. One by the outgoing Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. His final report really looks at poverty and the structural inequalities and the problems under which we are operating if we are to redress some of that. The key things from that is around poverty measure, over-dependency on private sector, these public-private sector financing mechanisms, and how they would may or may not, really showing not to address some of these structural problems. And certainly the most recent UN Secretary General remarks at the Nelson Mandela lecture series, that's also an important one to look at it from a position around poverty and women in particular. I want to move very quickly to what we can do to redefine. I think that's a good word, to redefine economic systems. I think that one of the really significant failures right now that we need to emphasize is around social safety nets. At the moment, our country's really first line of defense is really pension funds. And that's quite key for Fiji, Solomon Islands, and countries that do Papua New Guinea that have pension funds. And of course, this thing that's known as the indigenous systems, which is the other social safety net that we have. I think we need to really push quite hard, particularly from the women's movement, feminist movement, for basic income measures and protection. We really have to push to ensure that after the COVID-19, we have in place systems around to protect basic income. Insurance schemes for unemployed, we need to look at that quite structurally at national levels to begin to address the kinds of unemployment numbers that we are faced with. In Fiji, I think the ILO put the numbers up at 118,000. We've projected, if you project, and with tourists not arriving onto our shores anytime soon until 2021, you could be looking close to 200,000, close to a quarter of your population in unemployed. So it's either totally not getting an income or reduced hours or leave without pay. Who is to fund these kinds of income measures? Really, development partners, direct budgetary supports that's coming through now, and want to push quite hard around conditionality of budgetary supports to our countries and our national budgets. And in particular, positive conditionalities of direct budgetary supports needs to sustain, and in particular, income in governments and in critical sectors such as health, where we know a lot of the frontline is women, education, where again, frontline is also women. These are some of the ideas that I think we need to consider, and consider quite strongly. Positive subsidies, and I want to use the word positive subsidies because I think subsidies do get a hammering in terms of economics a lot, considered quite bad. You need to target specifically, and again, two things: positive subsidies and positive affirmative actions. You need to target farmers. You need to consolidate pricing for farmers, and particularly women farmers, at a very critical level. Price volatility will be really, really critical for internal markets within the next 3 to 6 months. You need to subsidize that. Again, who's to pay that? Direct budgetary support, grants, loans can begin to do some of those key things. One last thing, taxation. A lot of our international financial institutions have really paid a lot of attention around poverty and raising poverty measures. We need more emphasis going into taxation, wealth tax, corporate tax, social responsibility tax. Philanthropy needs to start paying tax. And I think this is a really critical area. If you can change emphasis of international financial institution to really plug in around wealth tax. Fiji is going to increase a VIP line for the wealthy to come in for tourism. Start to consider how to put on a wealth tax. Corporate taxes. Corporations have enjoyed tax breaks. This is now when they need to start paying. 20% corporate tax is necessary in our economic landscape. Social responsibility tax, people really don't talk much about this, but it's quite small. It's a small bracket of people. We need to increase that. And certainly I know the tourism industry in Fiji has paid environmental tax. We need to sustain that across larger, more destructive industries. That's it.
Okay. Thanks very much, Maureen. We did, we've got some responses from some claps from around the room. Thank you very much. We did certainly give you a very large question. Please redesign our entire way of exchange of goods and services. So thank you very much for that. For me, I've really taken away that point about inequalities, whether we're talking about gender inequality or other forms of inequality between and among countries, as making us so much more vulnerable now to the impacts, the economic impacts of the pandemic. On that note, and thinking about perhaps the specific vulnerabilities that women are facing, we might move to Brenda, if you can still hear me okay, Brenda, and ask you about how governments and development partners in what you've seen are responding to these specific vulnerabilities faced by women. It'd be great to hear some examples from the work that's happening in Papua New Guinea at the moment.
Hi, Tara, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share what's happening in Papua New Guinea. Going from the macro right down to the low level, so talking about market vendors and the informal economy, where the bulk of the population operates and their income. I think for us, in terms of how the government and development partners are responding, I'll probably speak specifically on what UN Women is doing to work with government to respond. We have seen that with COVID-19 and a number of restrictions happening in the country, it did definitely impact the informal economy. And for us, we know that the informal economy is also very big. It contributes about 12 billion kina per year, and it's made up of about 60% of which are women. So in markets which form a very small part of the informal economy, over 80 to 90% of the workers in markets are women. So we see that in terms of responding to women's vulnerabilities during this COVID-19 context, some of the actions taken by government and development partners to respond to the informal economy, especially around markets, was a step in the right direction. We did see when there were shutdowns, there were massive reductions in household income and issues around food security. In markets that UN Women have been working in, over 50% of income reduction. So we did some, sorry, I'm getting some notifications on my screen. Do I unmute myself?
No, you're great. Please continue.
Okay. All right, yes. So in responding, I think for us specifically, it's responding to making markets operational, keeping them safe and operational so that women are able to continue to make money. Whilst the informal economy is bigger than markets, we did see a lot of closure in street vending activities, other informal trading activities, and we are still working to look at ways of making those income earning activities safe and conducive for operation. But for markets, the response right now is through support from the Australian government. The PNG government is responding with some mandatory guidelines to enable markets to operate safely. So UN Women and a number of development partners, also through the Australian government's program, are funding this initiative, and we are engaged in supporting 14 markets in the country to be compliant to the state of emergency guidelines in PMG. So since markets have resumed operation, we've seen some increases in people's income. There have already been reports of, increase in food security. We were lucky enough that our government took some swift action to restrict movement in the initial stages when we had COVID. So I think we're having some cases now, but I think the impact has been slower for us. So we were able to come up with some strategies to make markets more compliant, look at other ways of diversifying income sources for women. So I think that's basically where we're at. I won't speak for everything that government's doing in responding, but for the efforts that we are engaged in, it's really to make sure that markets are operational and that women who are dominate that space are able to continue to make money and support their families.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Brenda, for sharing that perspective, kind of really focusing on that critical space for women in markets in Papua New Guinea. Thank you for that. We're going to now move to Funafuti if we still are able to be connected. Asita, I hope you're still there with us. What we're really interested in hearing from you about in your work with the Gender Affairs Division is how women's care work and women's unpaid domestic labor is really being increased during this time as the impact of the pandemic is being felt. Now, we understand that you've just recently done a bit of a rapid gender assessment around issues of livelihood and care work, and we'd love to hear more about that, Asita.
Tara, and thanks for the previous speakers who have set the context and everything from macro. In Tuvalu, when, well, first things first, Tuvalu is still COVID-free at the moment, but despite all that, there was a panic rush and people were spending money on unnecessary things, but their needs in, well, when I said unnecessary things, you know, like stockpiles of food and everything else, just in case, thinking there might not be boats coming into Tuvalu and flights are shut off and people are panicked just to stay in their homes. So with that in mind, people were rushing to the shops and spending all the money there. So the government, in response to having precautionary measures to prevent COVID, they were encouraging people to move to outer islands for food security and other measures as well. So there was a relocation here on Funafuti. Funafuti, there's half of the population of Tuvalu lives on Funafuti. So you can imagine, not everybody, most of the working people are from the outer islands. So we don't own lands here in Funafuti. We have to move to outer islands, to the islets. On Funafuti, you either have to stay with some families or friends, or if you are lucky enough that you are from Funafuti, then you have some parts to build a shelter on the islets. So with this and people moving around, the mobility of people at the time, there were 81% of the people interviewed. And most of them said that there was a big problem with the unpaid care work. There were more burden added to women's responsibilities, with less infrastructures on the islets. The food security over there is also limited resources. Even there's no electricity, the water becomes an issue for most families. Accessibility and even owning boats to be able to move to and from the main settlement was also a main obstacle for most families. So there was a big concern about all of that, and many people stayed in extended families or 30 people, 20 in one home. Even still at the moment, while the Funafuti community are still building homes to be able to accommodate in case there's some cases here in Tuvalu, that was that adds great responsibility and also on the unpaid care work that women provide on each other. So there was also pressure on the natural resources on the islets at this time because of overpopulation. You know, the coconut, not everybody would do that. So that is a great burden at the moment, and also, but this is only the beginning, as we normally see. The West is up, and we are still in that kind of panic stage. So right now on the outer islands, the island communities themselves, they're trying to shut their borders from the main island, from the capital. Also because of panic and to protect themselves as well. So yeah, there was a lockdown time when the boats had to bring in the cargoes. there was lockdown and women to access the social services, and also so there was a huge chaos in the capital, especially in Funafuti. The survey was actually done on Funafuti. So 80% of the people, of the women interviewed, they were very much concerned about the food security for their families, and also the safety of the kids, of the children. Now that everybody has to crowd under one roof, there's also the other securities as well to consider. Children were out of school for quite some time. They don't have the confidence in sending back their children to secondary schools, which are located on other islands. So, yeah, there was a lot of issues experienced by women. Women who are mostly also, it's not only on the unpaid care work, but even the small incomes that they earn through the handicrafts making, and the handicrafts making, they only can make that during their free times. But with burdens, with the relatives and families, and now staying in the extended or traditional way of staying, all that time has been converted to looking after the family, the elderly, the disabled, the children who are there the whole time. So women women who suffer from domestic violence too, now they are there with the perpetrator and the whole time, of course. And so in the report, if you can see, there was a drop on the domestic violence cases according to police report. It was from March until May, during compared to last year and the year before. This was due to, even though they say, oh well, COVID has brought peace to Tuvalu, but still there's no clear indication of what happens, where we assume, or from the past experiences, that people usually report incidents after some time. And secondly, the lockdown could also mean that women are confined within their homes and they don't have means to contact the police and those stuff like that. So the relocation has the great impact on many things, including the economic, the welfare of the families. If I may touch. Oh, okay.
No, I'll go ahead, Asita, and I might ask you to wrap it up on that note. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there was a stress level, the whole of the community, women, but I want to touch on the responses of the government. The government has, with the financial packages that they give in response to COVID, they have actually negotiated for financial institutions to be flexible around the loan repayments, and also to be able to allow loans to help to complement what the government has given out in terms of food items, just to cover for the short period, and also the financial packages that they are giving to families, especially the families who don't have any sort of income. And that includes women who are also engaged in small income generating activities, especially in the tourism and also other fields.
Many thanks, Asita. I was very hesitant to slow you down or stop you there, because it's really interesting to hear the work you've been doing and what's happening on the ground in Tuvalu, and really that the rapid assessment that you've conducted, providing us with such critical information about how this pandemic and it is impacting women in Tuvalu. So many thanks for that. It was really interesting to hear that, those key concerns around food security, children's safety, and of course the huge increase in the unpaid care burden. I'm going to invite Brigitte to also join in now. We were luckily that the technology held and we were able to hear you, Asita, but we might invite Brigitte, if you could just perhaps provide a 1-minute wrap up of some key points as well, just in case there were any sound issues for others. Thank you.
I don't think that there were, I think everything was quite well understood, isn't it? I don't have much to add. I think Asita made a good presentation, and
yeah, absolutely.
Yes. There's one thing though that I want to highlight that was in the report as well, is that one positive side of if we can find a positive way, was that people who were interviewed highlighted as well that the strong community ties in Tuvalu help people to cope better. It helped people to support each other, they share tools, they share housing, they share water tank. So what it means is, like, if you have more people, it means that more people are maybe in a precarious situation, and but still there's still the spirit of we have to help each other. It's also an opportunity to reconnect with the traditional ways of food security and to teach this to the children. So I think this is something as well to highlight, and maybe in the discussion talk about self-reliance, because Maureen talked about the macroeconomic situation, but what we find out in Tuvalu, and I think it's the same in many countries, is that the dependency on imported food make Pacific people even more vulnerable in the current situation. So how do we reshape the economy in the Pacific so that we build more self-reliance and people producing their own food and being less dependent on others?
Many thanks, Brigitte. Thank you for adding in that additional point, and you're quite right. If you could hear her well, so could we here in Suva. So thank you very much, both Asita and Brigitte, for sharing those perspectives from Tuvalu. It is really interesting what you've said about the community ties. Here in Fiji, in many cases they're working well. In some cases there are dysfunctions in those ties. In other cases, people have developed entirely new ways of fostering those ties. Thinking of the Facebook group, which is now quite well known, Bata for a Better Fiji, where we've used an older economic model, in fact, to help people cope with the effects of the pandemic. So we're going to move now, if that's all right with the panelists, to the Q&A portion of our discussion. We've got 20 minutes together, 15 minutes together to have this chat. So the team has been taking your questions, and what I'm looking at is there's a whiteboard with your questions that have been popped up here. We might start with an interesting question about cash transfers and how to target cash transfers at women workers in the informal sector. Now, I wonder, maybe we might go to Brenda if we could, with a start on that. So thinking about all forms of cash transfers, how we can really target those to women in the informal sector, outside of our formal pension schemes and things like that.
Thank you,
Tara.
I have a bit of unstable line. Sorry.
Just a moment, Brenda. I think we might have you might need to mute yourself on Zoom, and then we'll take you on the line. Yep, perfect. Thank you.
I'll just do audio because my internet's dropping off.
Okay, no worries.
Okay, thank you so much. For targeting women specifically in the informal economy, what we've seen is that often these large stimulus packages, they're geared towards, formal businesses. They're geared towards organizations that are able to meet the conditions for some of this support. And often the women in the informal economy do not meet any of those requirements. They don't have the security or any of the, like the security or equity to access loans or credit facilities. And even when they do, there's always issues around the use of that money. And when you look at households and how men and women are making decisions about the use of funds, often women do not have the control of household income, as well as, so there are issues around credit facilities and how we're able to support women directly. A lot of women in the markets and the informal economy use a lot of informal mechanisms to access credit and capital to do their business. And we know that that's just a volatile space, often leading to a lot of issues of violence when you don't have issues around repayment of this. They're unprotected by any laws or policies, so they really cannot access this fund or collect their money in a sort of legal way. So in terms of supporting these women directly, we've looked at, in some provinces that we are working in, local governments are already trying to come up with some innovative solutions for increasing women's access to capital and cash. Through like things like microbanks in some countries, we've seen that it works for some people, but not for everybody. So in markets, these women have very low levels of literacy, and most of them do not have bank accounts. They're less likely to access these formal services. So looking at other informal mechanisms, we've seen that through market vendors associations, working through this kind of groups to have good savings culture and giving loans and credit to the group, so they hold each other accountable, and they're able to provide cash for like services that they do. They can be involved in operations of markets as a group. They're able to get paid as a group. So right now we don't have actual cash transfer mechanisms. And that's a big gap that I also wanted to raise towards the end, is that there are no social protection measures, there are no cash transfer measures in place. And women are often forced to come up with these solutions themselves. And rural women are especially vulnerable. So I don't know if that's sort of answering the question.
No, that's really, thank you, Brenda. That's really helpful, and really that question is then highlighting perhaps a gap for us in terms of what are, if that's not something that exists currently. Maybe Asita, we could just go to you for a moment just to see, you mentioned that the government was, for example, giving out food packages in relation to, the food security concerns. Were there also cash transfers going as well, and were those directed at women?
Yes, definitely there were cash transfers, and this is like an immediate action, short-term response to help families with the situation. When I mentioned they did give $40 per person, the whole population, and there was also the 500K for each island kaupules, which is the local government, to make sure that they will respond with the necessary needs of the population. So that helped some of the women who don't have houses or have difficulties to relocate themselves, but because even on the outer islands, people were trying to relocate themselves from the main settlement. So so that's where the government assisted. And in the meantime, they also have they were assessing women who were engaged in small income generating businesses to actually assist them, and people and women who were the majority of the laid off workers, from the private sector. So the government were actually looking into ways of assisting them by encouraging them to continue producing handicrafts, with the Department of Trade paying for the products. So the government has done a lot of incentives to actually help the women here in Tuvalu with those, and in response to the rapid assessment that we did, and also to the TC Tino recovery. So that $40 per person wasn't only to respond to COVID, but was the combination of TC Tino and also the situation.
Thanks very much for that, Asita. Maybe just coming back to you, Maureen, and thinking about your general point around the need for social protection systems, and how we can best really support women and their communities, particularly in rural areas, working in the informal sector. Does that look like cash transfers? What does that look like for you?
I think really there needs to be some wider conversations had on this particular point, because I think this is one of the, I mean, if you look at the way governments are, and I think rightly pointed out that it's going to those in the formal sector that have lost jobs. And even accessing that in itself really gives you an idea of how difficult it is in terms of access to welfare benefit, unemployment benefit. Startups for businesses are going to be quite critical. I think there needs to be wider conversation around cash transfers. They are necessary as an immediate response. Cash is king right now, and you really need that. The House will need to take some time to reconsider so that we don't fall into the traps of before some of these initiatives. And again, that's what I was trying to say, that we need to really look at more positive, affirmative, strategic actions, more positive subsidies to really target women in particular. The system is such that even from formal sectors, if you women who have lost jobs, just trying to access their pension funds, social welfare funds, any of the things that governments have given out is already difficult. It's difficult because of where the locations are, generally in cities, out of reach, generally in English. The idea of virtual, and I just want to bring in technology, can play a critical answer to how we get better access for women around some of the systems and streamlining some of the systems. But I think more thought needs to be around cash and cash transfers and conversations. But it's clear that we need to start facilitating that and transitioning that quite carefully. I think Fiji just put out something on unemployment, in which you have 5 weeks in which you have to wait to see whether you will qualify for unemployment. It's a very bureaucratic system, very, very difficult system for people to navigate. It's quite structurally difficult for women to access this, in addition to all the roles of, looking after the elderly, children, food, gardening, all of that, to go through this system. So I think there are some issues around public service, corporations themselves, to enable these kinds of conversations to take place, and quite quickly. Banks really need to come to the forefront right now. It needs, the kinds of tax holidays, it needs to extend to people and also to governments in very significant ways. Just thinking about, mediums, M-Pesa has really worked well in Fiji for rural women, but the cost of doing business, the charges associated with cash transfers, that's a significant area that, even from your remittances from overseas to families in rural, the cost of really doing cash transfers and internally within countries are quite significant. So we need more players to come on board to really look at charges.
Yeah.
You're sending only $20 or $40, the charges is $3 to $4. That's quite serious when you're looking at it from trying to get more cash into people's hands.
Yeah.
So I think these are some of the key things, but it does require a space to really talk through cash transfers and the house.
Yeah, something, you know, perhaps us as the We Roundtable can have a further think about in terms of how do we consider gender responsive cash transfers, and there is work being done in this area. I know we're getting close to end time, and we are meant to go around and do a quick wrap up question. But before we do, Asita, I just wanted to come back to you because there was a lot of interest in what you had presented, as there were for all of the speakers, but there were some specific questions for Tuvalu. One of it was around, you'd mentioned this balance between women with greater care responsibilities and income generating work. So you mentioned, I think, that some of the women in handcrafting had stopped doing that work in order to deal with their care responsibilities, just how that balance was working out. And also in terms of the findings from your rapid assessment, are they available? Can they be shared or accessed by anyone? Thanks, Asita. Just checking if we've still got Asita on the line. Yep. Yeah, please go ahead, Asita.
Okay, the unpaid care work or the burden that women are, have, you know, because of the COVID. At the moment, a lot of women are still like on Funafuti, if we may specifically talk about the Funafuti community. Most of them are moving to one islet, which was a settlement as well. And all the work there, they're gonna build houses there and the whole new village. And all the women have to feed the voluntary work, the unity that Brigitte talked about. So when we have the social, so all the voluntary work, that means women have to be there on the islet to feed the men who work from morning until nighttime, and they have to return to the residence, to the main settlement. So women don't have the time really to have other staff or to be engaged in other small activities where they could get some money. Instead, they're spending the whole time there on the islet. And the women who have decided, who have moved there, they also, all their time also is to accommodate, you know, to accommodate all these people, including the women who voluntarily go to the islet every day. You know, the different groups of women who volunteered for that. So that's the second, the situation right now. And about the report, yes, definitely we can share that. At the moment, it's still with the cabinet, but they are just for information purposes. And I think the responses were, they were looking, reviewing their responses because of that, the assessment report. And they have requested if we can reach the outer islands as well, because they also want to know the situation in outer islands.
Yeah, that would be amazing to get to hear about the situation in the outer islands also. Thanks so much, Asita. So I'm afraid there are so many more amazing questions that are up here for you, and we'll certainly share them around as much as we can, and also share any resources that the panelists would like to send on the website. But for now, we come to really our last wrap-up question, just for each of the panelists to spend a minute or so to share your recommendations, if we could. We'll come to you, I think, first, Brenda. If you could share your recommendations for policymakers and development partners around the changes and reforms that you want to see so that women may more equitably participate in and benefit from the national economy, particularly in this time of great stress and pressure from the pandemic and its impacts. So over to you, please, Brenda. Oh, sorry, just before you start, grateful if we could just try switching on cameras just for this final round and see how we go. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Can you hear me? Or?
Yeah, fantastic.
Sorry. All right, thank you. I think some clear recommendations are coming in based on what the other speakers have said, and also all the different work that we are all doing. So especially to do with how the informal economy workers are protected, there needs to be more emphasis on looking at some form of social protection or insurance for informal economy workers and the businesses that they engage in. So we've seen that, you know, when you have economic shocks like this, lockdowns happen, people are unable to trade. Informal economy workers have no other ways of accessing income or earning money. So clear one is around social protection for informal economy workers, looking at ways of diversifying the income sources so they're less reliant on products. For PNG, we have a lot of people who rely on diplomat trade, and that's one area that's been really affected. There's a lot of money circulating around the trade of diplomats, and with COVID-19, that's been greatly affected. So looking at ways of diversifying the kind of economic activities that people in the informal economy are doing. We know that, you know, any kind of credit or financial services that are provided needs to also consider the needs of women who are especially not able to meet conditions. So looking at financial packages and support services that are responsive and able to cater for their needs and what kind of security they're able to provide. The other important thing is really around ensuring that like market infrastructure that would enable it to operate needs to be there, and then local authorities are supported to implement gender responsive policies, ensuring that these facilities can stay open and that they're meeting the needs of women. So there's a lot of, the bottom line is that even if we do increase women's access to income, earning opportunities, there's also the issue around their rights and power dynamics in the household that limit how the decisions they make about household use and income. So there should also be a lot of behavior change programs still going on with families, trying to get families to be able to appreciate gender equality and rights of women in the household, rights of women over their household income, and helping them to have a more savings culture so they can reinvest in their business and be able to grow. So I think there's a number of policy changes that need to happen to make it more conducive for women to operate, and also some behavior change, programs with households and families to ensure that women do have control over the income that they generate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Brenda. That's a wonderful, comprehensive list of recommendations. I think, Brenda, for Prime Minister, we all agree here in this room. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Asita, maybe we could come to you now, thinking through all that you've learned, and what would be sort of your key recommendations around women's better, more equal participation?
I guess there needs to be more discussions around the economic systems, and even to having budgetary support for social protections. And there should be some kind of model of economic development for the Pacific women, and if not for Tuvalu. Something that really works in the context of us, given the situation that we are in at the moment, and knowing of all the inequalities with the structural and the systemic, we all know that. And also the other thing is for us to look at improving the national trading of local products, giving values to our own local produce, so that in the meantime, this may be an opportunity for us to do that, because we in Tuvalu, we're so much dependent on imported food. So I think this is an opportunity for us in that sense. and also making sure that people, the mobility of people throughout this situation can be accessible to basic public services like the social services, social protection services should be available, water, electricity, all the basic needs on the relocation premises, on the relocation sites should be accessible to all. And because this would alleviate women's unpaid care work and the load that they're having on those islands. And the other one would be to adopt measures to support the development of handicrafts as an industry rather than an ad hoc to women, but this should be an investment to improve the quality and access to markets, especially women in Tuvalu. They should be support the financial inclusion of women, and women themselves should be included in the decision making at all levels, especially in the finance ministry in terms of economics. Women should be there because this thing should be based on the experiences of women themselves, in the women who are mostly in the informal sector.
Many thanks for that comprehensive list as well, Asita. Really, so many of them, of course, giving us the insights into what's needed in Tuvalu, but I think really so much we can learn also for other parts of the Pacific, certainly small island states, but also in other parts of the region as well. So thank you again for that. And Brigitte, just checking in with you, whether there were any burning additional recommendations that you might like to add in?
No, Asita said it all. It's good.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks very much. Well, we might come then back to Suva for the final word for Maureen. Maureen, you've really been talking quite a bit to the types of changes that you'd like to see, but are there any additional recommendations you'd like to make for us?
I think we just need more emphasis on social protection measures. I think that's quite critical. I want to go back on the positive conditionality, which really targets social safety nets and systems. Positive subsidies, it's really critical. If you want to do anything around agriculture, supporting small, medium, micro enterprises, you need to subsidize and hold very carefully food pricing to allow for any kind of diversification. So you need positive subsidies targeting particularly the agriculture sector. Positive affirmative actions also looking at cooperative models, which is one of our biggest strengths in the Pacific. Cannot emphasize how effective that would be if we start looking at grant make it easy. And I think my last point is really, we really need to work hard to streamline access to cash for women at all levels, whether it's from the public service, corporate, banks, grant making. We need to simplify processes so that women can access a lot of this. The bureaucracy tied to accessibility remains quite high for women. So just to end with that.
Many thanks, Maureen. On that note, I know we've gone 3 minutes over time, so I thank you so much, everyone, for bearing with us. But such interesting discussions from our team of experts here, coming at us from Quebec, Funafuti, Port Moresby, and Suva. I'd like to thank the 80 of you at one time who joined us online, and the many more who are watching the live stream on Facebook. This is being recorded and will be available through the Pacific Women website very soon. I'd like to thank everyone in the room for bearing with us through quite a strange thing of all being online together. And we'd like to say goodbye and hope to see you again at our next discussion in the future. Naka.